I grew up in a small town in rural southern Mississippi, almost like a one-horse town. Everybody knew everybody. I did small things like sneaking out, underage drinking, and that environment is where I met Chad. When I first met him, the first thing that I noticed about him was his outgoing personality. For lack of a better word, he was very hyperactive, very go, 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 let's do. And he was also very attractive. I was very young and naive and lived in this fairy tale that I needed a man that would rescue me and take care of me. Chad gave me all those things. He made me feel safe. He made me feel secure. In the middle of nowhere, down a long dirt country road in the middle of the woods. For the first few weeks, we just lived together, trying to figure out what we were to each other. We would have bonfires and we would go fishing, and just the country way of living was really what it was. At that time, Chad was an attractive guy that was fun to be around. Early on in my pregnancy, there was a shift in the way Chad treated me. He started isolating me more. He slowly alienated me from family. Being an outdoorsy, tomboy, country girl, I had a lot of male friends. If I was allowed to be around him, he had to be in my presence, and it was very few and far between. And his jealousy towards those male friends fractured a lot of those friendships for a long time. Chad paved highways all across the southern part of Mississippi. He sometimes would be gone 5 days a week. I mainly would see him on the weekends. While he was gone, I was still isolated in the home that we lived in. He made sure of that because he would unplug the landline and take it with him to work. He would also take the only vehicle that we had and the cell phone with him. I was pregnant. I was terrified to be alone there in the middle of nowhere without a way to go or a way to communicate with anyone. One day he came home that weekend from working out of town, immediately jumps in the shower. You know, that was an immediate red flag for me. He's like, why, before he even touches me, does he have to get in the shower? And then I just decided to go through the cell phone, and I noticed there was incoming and outgoing calls to the same number that wasn't saved in his phone, and that he was talking to him for an hour or two at a time. So I ended up writing down that phone number and then calling from the house phone. And the lady informed me that they had been having an affair for about 6 months.
Did you think you could confront him about it?
I always had problems with self-esteem from a very early age. With Chad and with a lot of abusers, what they do is they break down your self-esteem, your self-confidence, and make you feel like there's no way that you could survive without them. I'm not sure when his interest in the military started. He had a almost unnatural obsession with firearms, and I think that probably played a big role in him originally joining the National Guard. Where I grew up in rural Mississippi, it is not uncommon for everyone to own firearms. But what was unusual with Chad's interest with firearms is that it went a little bit beyond that. He had up to 20 firearms, including assault rifles and handguns. He had an AR-15. He had an AK-47. He had a 12-gauge shotgun, 45 caliber handgun, .357 Magnum, and a .38 Special. That's the ones that I remember. And it was less about owning the firearms than the comments that he made regarding those firearms. The need to stockpile weapons in case, if there was ever an instance where he needs to be in a militia where to overthrow the government. When I was with him, I was 17 to 21 years old. It was very terrifying to me. There was an instance where we were driving down a back road in the middle of the woods. I remember it being a really hot day. In my area, there's a lot of strays and stuff that get dumped in the country. And a dog was just walking down the side of the road, and Chad stopped all of a sudden, and he called the dog to the driver door. And the dog was happy to see him, wagging his tail. And he grabbed his .45 caliber handgun out from underneath the seat. And he was saying, "Come here, Poochie, come here." And the dog kind of put its front paws on the side of our vehicle. And at that point, he just shot the dog in the head. To see someone be so evil towards animals was something I had never witnessed before in my life, and it traumatized me, it scared me, and I think it was to let me know that he's capable of doing some pretty horrible things if I didn't get in line. Chad was extremely peculiar about the way the house was supposed to be. He made it obviously clear that what my station in life was to be a housewife, a mother, and a maid. It was a compulsive, it was obsessive. He would want things lined up a certain way. All of the vegetables in the cabinets, they all had to be grouped together. The corn together, green beans together, all the labels facing a certain way. It all had to be lined in a uniform, straight manner. Usually when I knew that he was heading in for the weekend, I would spend that whole day before scrubbing with Q-tips, toothbrushes, just getting everything right. But in those occasions when something slacked, I paid for it. Dirt on the floor could cause him to empty out and dump out dressers and tear clothes out of closets and flip mattresses off of beds, swipe clean dishes off surfaces. There was instances where his nose would almost touch my nose. To look into his face, it looked sometimes like he was looking straight through me. Like he wasn't even looking at me, he was looking straight through to something else, and his eyes almost became black. And as time went on, the violent aspect of our relationship really, really got more intense. The first time that Chad ever laid hands on me was about 6 weeks after I found out that I was pregnant. I went into the bedroom, into a dresser, and he was sleeping because he was working the night shift. And the drawer squeaked, and it woke him up. And he immediately jumped up out of bed, grabbed me by my hair, dragged me out of the room, kind of tossed me into the hallway and slammed the door on my face. I was shocked. I didn't know what had just happened. I was confused. I was scared. My heart was racing. I didn't know what to do. And I just stood there dumbfounded. And then after a few minutes, he came out and he wrapped his arms around me from behind and just said that he was sorry, that he had never done anything like that before to someone, and that he was probably half asleep when he done it, and that it would never happen again. At the time, I believed him. You know, I woke him up. He's tired. He works. He provides for me. And I was so inconsiderate to go in there and wake him up. I didn't want to leave because there were times where things were really, when they were good, they were okay. And it kind of helped soften when things weren't okay. It didn't last long compared to the good times that we had. Scott was born on January 9th, 1998. I was 18 years old, and I instantly fell in love with him. From the moment he took his first breath, he was a ball of energy. Things were really good for a little while after that. There are times where we got along great, and we laughed and we loved, and he would shower me with compliments and gifts and love. So for a little while after Scott was born, he kind of helped us have better times and make good memories of him when he was a newborn. It was calm, and there were no violent instances where he hurt me. We got married when I was 6 months pregnant with my second child at the time, Cynthia. There was no proposal, there was nothing romantic that happened. It's just, hey, we're getting married. We walked in front of a judge, and it took about 10 minutes, and I wore blue jeans and a t-shirt, and that was it. It was done in 15 minutes. After what I would call a honeymoon break, we would just eventually circle back around. By the time I was pregnant with Cynthia, I kind of knew the routine. He would be angry, he would become violent, he would become remorseful, and you could see a pattern forming. I lost all my friends, and my family were disappointed in me and did not like him. It made it really hard to have a relationship with them. hadn't been long since I had Cynthia. She was probably a few months old. One day, he had been working out of town and he had came in and I had made spaghetti about 3 days before. And he made the comment, "Why is this still in here?" He grabbed me by my hair and made me get on my knees in the middle of the kitchen. And he set the pot of spaghetti in front of me. And he started scooping handfuls of spaghetti out and force feeding me. He's like, "Eat it. If you expect me to eat it, then you should have no problem eating it." And he started rubbing it on my face and in my hair. He would take his hand and like push my face back like that. He started punching me and slapping me around. He drug me into our bedroom where he continued to assault me and continued to beat me for a considerable amount of time. After he'd done that, he made me scrub the floors on my hands and knees with bleach rags to clean up the spaghetti sauce. There was something about that day, him treating me like I was not human. By the next morning, I had 2 black eyes and a fractured rib on my right side. He had never touched the kids in an aggressive manner, but it terrified me, and it terrified me, like, how far is this gonna escalate? I never realized that he, even as evil and as vile as he is, that he would go that far. When Chad left for work, I got my children dressed and myself dressed, and I walked to the nearest neighbor where I could use their phone. I called my family, and they said that I would need to press charges on him. He beat me pretty bad, so I pressed charges on him. He was arrested and booked, and once he went to court, the judge had an agreement with his lawyer that he would seek psychiatric help in a inpatient facility and start medication. After he was released from the psychiatric facility, I was very much on guard. But over time, I felt like I saw a difference in him and that the therapy and medication was working. I didn't know not to believe him. It all goes down to him spinning it around to make it somehow seem my fault. A few months later, I became pregnant with Joe, my last child. At that point, I had 3 children by him in 3 years. And I realized that how was I ever going to escape this relationship if I kept having children by this man? And unbeknownst to him, it was absolutely a big risk, and I was terrified the whole time. I went behind his back and had my tubes tied while he was out of town one week. Chad was working out of town. While I was waiting for him to come home, I had went to see my dad that day, and I was a little late getting home, and he was frustrated that I was late, and he started in on me. Scott at the time was 3, and Scott ran into the living room as he was beating me and tried to separate us and tried to get in between us. And at that time, Chad picked him up, threw him onto the couch, and slapped him across the back so hard that it left a handprint. He always kept a handgun in the nightstand, and it always stayed loaded. And he laid me across the bed, and he straddled me with his knees on each side of my shoulders. And he told me to open up my mouth. And he forced the gun into my mouth. And he got really close to me, his mouth to my ear. And he said, "Do you see the evil in my eyes?" I thought I was dead. And I vomited on me and him and the gun. And at that point, he pulled me off of the bed, put me on my knees, and at this point, he put it to the back of my head. It was like a switch. He went from this aggressive, crazy, evil mindset to talking normally on the phone, setting up arrangements. And he said, "Get in the vehicle. We're going, get the kids up, get a towel for your face. And if you let anyone see your face, I will kill you when we get home. I will promise you that I will kill you." I had always made a promise to myself. I said, he can hurt me as much as he wants, but the first time he ever puts a hand on my children, I will be gone. And so I got the kids into the van. He drove to the house, and I just prayed the whole way there. I just said, "God, make a way for me to escape right now. I'll never look back. I swear to you." And he stepped out of the vehicle and was walking up to their door. And I jumped into the driver's seat and I locked the door. And I probably did about 60 miles an hour in reverse out of their driveway. And when I went to put it in drive to go forward, he had run across their small yard and jumped in front of the vehicle. And he was mouthing, "I'm gonna kill you." And I just closed my eyes and I pressed the gas. He could do whatever he wanted to me, and I would put up with it. But I always said he'll never hurt my kids. But I always had this knot in my stomach that something was going to happen. He came before a judge. Chad would know exactly what to do. He knew that he needed to show remorse to the judge and to immediately admit fault and check himself into a psychiatric facility voluntarily and start medication. And that way it looked like he was sincere in getting help and that he was wanting to change. And I knew that wasn't true. He started the divorce proceedings the next month. And that's where the fight for custody began. And he said, "You don't do exactly what I tell you to do within the divorce proceedings, then I'll take the kids and you'll never see them again." Sorry. If he said that he was going to take my children from me and I was never going to see them again, I believe that he would make that happen. Even though I wasn't to break that bond with them because it was so tight. I think in this picture that Scott's emotions in it are genuine. I think that Chad's is for the camera. This is Scott. He loved to dress up in his dad's army gear. It's one of my favorite pictures. After our divorce, I decided that I was going to stop depending on men for my livelihood and that I was going to step up and take care of myself. I can't think of anything more empowering for a woman than to join the United States Army, and that's what I did. I just had recently graduated basic training with the United States Army. I actually met Eric through one of his friends.
January 1st of 2007, a friend of mine had gone to a New Year's Eve party. I was on duty that night. The following afternoon, he called me and said, "Hey, I met a girl. Will you come with me? She has a friend." We kind of hit it off, and we liked each other a lot. It got serious pretty quickly.
When the kids first met Eric, Scott was 10, Cynthia was 9, and Joe was 8.
We went to the beach when I played catch on the beach, and their dad had never done that with them. The kids throughout the years have gone back and forth from dad to us. The teenage years in particular were a little bit difficult. Their love for their father and what he was constantly telling them was kind of against all the rules and expectations that we were trying to set in our house. We had his father telling Scott that he didn't have to listen to me. And that caused a kind of a rift. So Scott, he was very outgoing, and he lived the kind of life where he didn't care who was looking. He was the guy that everybody invited to the party because he was gonna bring it. I met Ched on a few occasions. Jessica always asked me to maintain a cordial relationship with him for the kids. And so I tried to do that. I will tell you that there's not a single time that I have been around Chad Graves that I have not had a gun on me, though, because I do not trust that man.
We actually met in the 7th or 6th grade, but when we got to high school, we kind of went our separate ways until he contacted me on Facebook. He's very, very charming. He would open the car door for me, help me put my seatbelt on, just very, very gentlemanlike. I was aware Chad was on medication. A month or so, I guess, 3 months maybe after we got together, he told me that he had had some issues with PTSD from being in the Army, because as far as me and him, he had not shown any violent side yet. Chad would tell me and Scott about some of the things he'd done in the military. He told us that he was a commander on a Bradley, and they hit an IED, and it flipped the Bradley, and he landed on his head, and that's how he got injured in Iraq. I believe Scott was 16 years old when I met him. Scott was very, very loyal to his daddy. It didn't matter what Chad done to him, he would always forgive him and hug him and tell his daddy that he loved him. No matter what Chad did, he always forgave him.
I woke up like it was any other day. I got up, made me some coffee, and I noticed that I had a missed message on Facebook from someone that I did not recognize. It stated, "Hello, I'm a friend of Chad and Stacy's, and Stacy's trying to reach you. It's an emergency. Please call her back at this number." And so immediately my first thought was, they've probably got into an argument and they fought. So I called, and as soon as Stacy answered the phone, I couldn't understand her. She was screaming and crying and saying over and over that he killed him.
On August the 16th of 2018, Scott asked his dad if he could go to his grandmother's house. And Chad told him no. And things escalated from there. Chad was in the bed. I was standing beside the bed talking to Chad. And the next thing I know, Chad jumped up out of bed, pushed Scott into a corner. That's where Chad's shotgun was. Scott grabbed the nozzle of the gun, and then Chad grabbed it, and that's when they started fighting over it. They worked their way into the dining room, fighting over it, wrestling over it. From where I was standing, I couldn't see where Scott was, but Chad I could see, and he had the shotgun in his hand, and I said, put the gun down, what are you doing? And he just looked at me with a blank look, and he racked the shotgun and then fired. I'm sorry. I come running out of the bedroom to get to Scott, and Chad got in front of me and told me, don't look at him, don't touch him, call 911. I was in such shock. And then after that, it's all a blank until the police get there. The police took me out in the breezeway of the apartment. I'm in my pajamas, no shoes. Chad was to the left of me, and I remember them arresting and handcuffing him. But they took me to a police car. It's pouring rain this night. From there, he goes to the VA, to the mental hospital.
I was at work. It was about 9 o'clock in the morning. I was on a break, and Jessica called me, hysterical. And she's screaming into the phone, he killed him, he killed him, he killed my baby.
And I prayed for God to send him back to me, and that he could take me. And then the next thing I remember was being in the front yard on my knees, and a police officer from our town pulling up to be with me until Eric could make it. And I fell onto hot asphalt and laid in the fetal position. Well, my whole world just fell apart. I immediately knew there was no way that it was self-defense, because I know my son, and I know what kind of heart he had, and I know how evil Chad was, and I knew that he would say whatever he needed to try to get out of trouble. I let fear drive me to accept the custody agreement. And I will, to this day, for the rest of my life, feel guilt and anguish over that decision.
They looked at all the evidence. All the shotgun pellets were in the baseboards of the floor. The way the blood was pooled showed that Scott was on the floor when he was shot. So he was not a threat for Chad. He could have put the gun down at any time. Chad shot Scott like it wasn't nothing to him. And I can't comprehend it. The police arrested him on August the 29th of 2018 at the Biloxi VA when he was being discharged.
With Chad being manipulative, he found this perfect opportunity to say, hey, I have PTSD. But anybody that knew Chad before he deployed knew that this behavior didn't come around because of PTSD. Because he was abusing people and being violent way before he ever saw combat. In which we later found out he, in fact, never saw combat. People don't realize that not every job that you do in the military puts you in harm's way or puts you in a combat situation. I contacted several of his Army buddies, and they told me early on in his deployment, he was deemed a liability because of a negligent discharge. They pulled him off of the front lines and put him behind a computer.
He lied about everything that he did in the military. I would have felt betrayed. I believe he uses PTSD as a crutch. I mean, you don't lie about stuff like that.
When I saw him walk in, I was shocked at his appearance, his age, rightfully so, being in jail for the last 3 years. I saw very little remorse. They told me I could have a few moments to speak, and I took 6 minutes to give my victim's impact statement.
Part of this grief journey is to watch my other children grow up and have to deal with the loss of their brother.
I looked him in the face, and there was no expression, except for the fact when I said, Scott was the only child that loved you unconditionally and forgave you for everything you ever did to him. And at that point, he shook his head yes. And then they asked him if he wanted to speak, and he said no. And then they sentenced him. The fact that he could get out in 6 years consumed me. I kept thinking, what do I need to do proactively as a parent to protect my remaining children? How do I protect us all?
He was just a mean, evil person who could do that to their own child and not show any remorse.
In the back of my head, always believed that one day Chad would go too far. But I never thought that it would be one of his kids. And furthermore, I never thought that it would be Scott. The one kid that always stood by him, always defended him. Chad didn't become a monster because of Iraq. Chad was a monster from his teenage years to the point where he decided to pull the trigger on his own son.
For a long time, I felt like a piece of me died. I got justice for it to some degree. I was honored to be his mother. The world is really missing out with him not being here anymore.
There are cities that seem to reinvent themselves every few decades. San Francisco was one of them. By the early 1970s, the city had become a symbol of freedom. Young dreamers arrived with backpacks and guitars. Artists filled cramped apartments overlooking steep streets wrapped in morning fog. Protest movements challenged old traditions, and neighborhoods that had once been quiet suddenly pulsed with music, laughter, and the belief that people could finally become whoever they truly were. For thousands of gay men across America, San Francisco represented something even greater. It represented survival. They came from small Midwestern towns where neighbors remembered every secret. They came from southern communities where a rumor alone could destroy a career. They came from military families, religious households, and marriages built upon expectations instead of love. Some left behind parents who never spoke to them again. Others packed everything they owned into a single suitcase and boarded buses headed west, convinced that somewhere beyond the mountains was a place where they would no longer have to pretend. They believed they had found it. During the day, the streets around Castro slowly transformed into a community unlike any other in the United States. Cafes overflowed with conversations. Bookstores displayed literature that had once been hidden behind locked cabinets. Couples walked together with a confidence that would have seemed impossible only a few years earlier. Yet freedom is rarely complete. Not in those years. Not in that city. Even in San Francisco, countless men continued living double lives. A respected lawyer might remove his wedding ring before entering a neighborhood bar after sunset. A successful businessman could spend an evening laughing with friends before quietly returning home to a wife who never suspected another life existed beyond late-night meetings and unexplained absences. A diplomat might carefully avoid being photographed in the wrong place. A teacher feared losing his job if someone recognized him. The city offered acceptance. The rest of the country often did not. That invisible line between public respectability and private truth would become one of the most powerful weapons ever handed to a killer. Because fear has many forms. Sometimes fear keeps witnesses silent. Sometimes fear convinces victims to meet strangers in places where no one is watching. And sometimes fear solves a murderer's greatest problem before the crime has even begun. Long before investigators gave him a name, long before newspaper headlines transformed him into an urban legend, he was simply another face in a crowded room. He did not shout. He did not threaten. He did not appear dangerous. According to the few people who survived encounters with him, he was polite, soft-spoken, neatly dressed, intelligent enough to keep conversations flowing naturally. He listened more than he spoke. His eyes lingered on faces with unusual concentration, not in an intimidating way, but almost as though he were studying them. Then he would reach into his pocket. Not for a weapon. For paper. For a pencil. He sketched. Simple lines at first. A forehead. The curve of a nose. The outline of a smile. Nothing elaborate. Nothing that would make anyone suspicious. Just enough to surprise strangers with how quickly their likeness appeared beneath the moving pencil. It was charming. Unexpected. Disarming. People laughed. Some leaned closer to watch. Others complimented his talent. For a few brief minutes, the stranger across the table became someone interesting instead of someone dangerous. Perhaps that was the point all along. Because trust is not always stolen. Sometimes it is carefully drawn, one pencil stroke at a time. No one knows exactly how many portraits he created. No one knows how many conversations ended harmlessly with a handshake before each person walked away into the night. Those stories disappeared into history. The conversations that mattered ended differently. A suggestion. A quiet walk. Fresh air by the ocean. Somewhere less crowded. Somewhere they could continue talking. Somewhere private. The distance between a crowded bar and complete isolation was often only a few hundred yards. That was all he needed. The Pacific Ocean has its own language after dark. The waves never stop speaking. They pound against black rocks with endless patience, swallowing smaller sounds until footsteps disappear beneath the rhythm of water and wind. Ocean Beach could feel peaceful during daylight. Families spread blankets across the sand. Children chased gulls while surfers waited patiently beyond the breaking waves. At night, it became something else entirely. Mist drifted inland like slow-moving smoke. Streetlights dissolved into pale halos. The horizon vanished. Even familiar places seemed capable of hiding impossible things. Golden Gate Park carried a different kind of silence. Massive trees blocked the moonlight. Winding paths twisted between shadows that shifted whenever branches moved overhead. In certain places, the city seemed impossibly far away despite being only minutes from busy neighborhoods. There were countless places where two people could disappear from public view. There were countless places where someone could scream without anyone knowing exactly where the sound had come from. If they screamed at all. On January 24, 1974, San Francisco woke beneath another cold winter sky. The fog had settled low across the coastline before dawn, clinging stubbornly to the beach as though reluctant to surrender the night. Somewhere along Ocean Beach, a body lay waiting. The man was 49 years old. His name was Gerald Kavanagh. A Canadian immigrant. A human being whose life had stretched across nearly 5 decades, before ending in unimaginable violence. His wounds immediately told investigators something disturbing. This had not been an accident. It had not been a robbery gone wrong. Someone had attacked him with extraordinary force at close range. A knife leaves behind an intimacy that firearms never do. Every wound requires another deliberate movement. Another decision. Another moment in which the attacker could have stopped. But the attacker hadn't stopped. He kept going. Standing above another human being, close enough to hear breathing, close enough to feel resistance, close enough to watch life disappear. The ocean carried away footprints. Wind erased smaller details. Nature, indifferent as always, began quietly dismantling the scene before investigators had fully understood what they were looking at. Police examined the area. Questions outnumbered answers. Who was Gerald meeting? Why had he come here? Who had seen him last? Where was the person responsible? There were no immediate witnesses. No obvious suspect. No clear motive. Like so many homicide investigations, it initially appeared to be an isolated tragedy. One file among hundreds. One grieving family. One more name destined for storage shelves inside police archives. No one standing over that first investigation could know they were opening the earliest chapter of one of San Francisco's most haunting unsolved serial murder cases. Because killers who become legends almost never announce themselves. Their patterns reveal themselves slowly. One victim. Then another. Then another. Investigators begin noticing similarities that once seemed meaningless. Locations. Methods. Victim profiles. Small details that refuse to remain coincidences. Months passed. Life continued. Streetcars climbed impossible hills. Tourists photographed the Golden Gate Bridge disappearing into clouds. Nightlife flourished. Music drifted through open bar doors. Laughter echoed down sidewalks where strangers searched for companionship in a city that promised belonging. Somewhere within those same crowds walked a man carrying paper and pencil. Perhaps people noticed him. Perhaps they remembered the sketches long afterward. Perhaps they even kept them. A folded portrait tucked inside a drawer. A forgotten face drawn by someone whose name they never learned. Imagine looking at such a sketch years later. Imagine realizing the artist may have become one of America's most elusive serial killers. The thought alone is enough to send a chill through history. Yet history rarely arrives with dramatic warnings. It moves quietly, patiently, almost invisibly. Just like the man investigators would eventually call the Doodler. He did not chase strangers through crowded streets. He did not force his way into locked homes. Instead, he entered people's lives through ordinary conversation, through shared smiles, through the universal comfort of feeling seen by another person. That may be the most unsettling detail of all. His first weapon was never the knife. It was attention. He noticed people who had spent years believing society refused to notice them at all. He listened. He smiled. He drew their faces with remarkable speed. And somewhere between the final pencil stroke and the darkness waiting beyond the city lights, another life quietly slipped toward an ending that no one could yet see coming. For investigators, serial murder is often imagined as a puzzle that eventually comes together. A fingerprint matches an old file. A witness remembers one forgotten detail. A confession arrives after years of silence. The pieces lock into place, and history finally has an ending. The Doodler case never offered that kind of comfort. Instead, it became a story filled with missing pieces. Pieces that may have been buried beneath decades of fear. Pieces carried to the grave by people who could never tell anyone where they had been on certain nights. Pieces washed away by rain, fog, salt water, and time. That is what makes this case so unsettling. It is not simply about a killer who escaped justice. It is about a city that was changing faster than the world around it could accept. To understand why this murderer remained hidden, it is necessary to understand the invisible lives his victims were forced to lead. In modern America, it can be difficult to imagine just how dangerous it once was to admit that you were gay. Today, a photograph shared online might receive support from thousands of strangers. In the early 1970s, that same photograph could cost someone everything. A career built over decades. A military pension. Professional licenses. Custody of children. The respect of parents. The trust of lifelong friends. Sometimes even a place to live. Many of the men who gathered in San Francisco had escaped places where silence had become second nature. They learned to lower their voices when discussing personal matters. They became experts at changing pronouns during conversations. They invented business trips that never happened and late-night meetings that existed only to explain an absence. Every habit of survival became another layer of secrecy. And secrecy has consequences. Imagine standing in a crowded bar, finally surrounded by people who understand you, while still glancing over your shoulder every few minutes. Imagine laughing freely for the first time in years, yet instinctively lowering your head whenever someone unfamiliar walks through the door. Freedom existed. But fear remained only a heartbeat away. The killer understood that world. Whether he belonged to it, or merely observed it from the outside, has never been answered. What investigators do know is that he seemed remarkably comfortable approaching men in places where strangers met every night. There was no rush in his movements. No desperation. He appeared to know exactly how long to remain a stranger before becoming familiar. He could sit quietly with a drink in front of him, watching conversations flow around the room. Music drifted through smoke-filled air. Bartenders polished glasses beneath warm yellow lights. People flirted. Friends embraced after weeks apart. New arrivals searched every face, hoping tonight might become the beginning of something meaningful. Somewhere among them sat a young man carrying a sketch pad. His appearance rarely raised concern. According to the descriptions later provided by surviving witnesses, he looked educated, clean, respectful. His clothing blended comfortably into the crowd. He possessed none of the obvious traits people instinctively associate with violence. Perhaps that was why no one remembered feeling afraid. Fear usually announces itself. Danger often does not. He would begin with ordinary conversation. Where are you from? How long have you lived in the city? Do you come here often? Questions that thousands of strangers ask every day. Then, almost casually, he would offer to draw. Most people enjoy being noticed. It is a simple human desire. To feel interesting. To feel attractive. To become, even briefly, the center of another person's attention. His sketches accomplished exactly that. A few confident lines transformed blank paper into a recognizable face. The portrait did not need to be perfect. Its purpose was never artistic greatness. Its purpose was connection. A pencil became an invitation. A portrait became trust. Trust became opportunity. An opportunity, somewhere beyond the lights of the city, became violence. There is something profoundly disturbing about that transformation. Art is often associated with beauty, creation, expression, memory. In this case, it became the opening act of destruction. The same hands capable of gently tracing someone's smile across paper were later capable of gripping a knife with terrifying force. That contradiction has fascinated criminologists for decades. How does someone move so effortlessly between kindness and brutality? How does a calm conversation become unimaginable violence within the span of a single evening? Those questions remain unanswered, because the only person who truly knows has never publicly spoken. As investigators would later discover, several victims had been stabbed repeatedly. Not once. Not twice. Again and again. Knife attacks demand proximity. The attacker hears breathing, feels movement, adjusts with every strike. Unlike a gun fired from several feet away, a knife transforms murder into something intensely personal. Every wound requires intention. Every movement is a decision renewed. That detail led many investigators to believe these crimes were driven by something deeper than financial gain. Nothing suggested robbery. Wallets were often still present. Personal belongings remained nearby. The victims themselves appeared to be the focus. But why? Hatred. Self-loathing. A desire for control. An internal conflict projected onto strangers. Without an identified offender, every psychological profile remains incomplete. Experts can examine patterns. They cannot read the thoughts of a ghost. As the months following Gerald Kavanaugh's murder unfolded, San Francisco continued moving through its ordinary routines. Morning commuters filled cable cars. Street musicians played along Fisherman's Wharf. Couples watched the sun disappear behind the Pacific. Children chased pigeons through Union Square. Nothing about the city suggested a predator was quietly adapting, learning, and perhaps becoming more confident with every passing season. The most frightening serial offenders rarely appear monstrous between murders. They shop for groceries, read newspapers, smile politely at neighbors, stand in line for coffee. They exist within ordinary life, so completely that hindsight becomes the only reason anyone notices them. Somewhere in that city, the man later called the Doodler almost certainly continued living his daily routine. Perhaps he attended classes. Perhaps he worked a regular job. Perhaps friends described him as intelligent or thoughtful. No public record answers those questions with certainty. What history preserves instead is absence. An unknown name. An unknown address. An unknown future. And yet the consequences of his actions became painfully real. Investigators slowly began encountering scenes that refused to leave their memories. Bodies discovered in isolated locations. Violent wounds. Victims connected, however quietly, to the same hidden social world. Patterns emerged cautiously. No detective wants to declare a serial killer too early. Doing so risks panic. Doing so risks overlooking alternative explanations. But ignoring similarities can be even more dangerous. Every experienced homicide investigator eventually develops an instinct. Not based on superstition. Based on repetition. Crime scenes begin speaking a language of their own. The angle of injuries. The choice of location. The timing. The absence of theft. The small details invisible to the public, but unmistakable to those who study violent death every day. Somewhere inside the San Francisco Police Department, conversations began changing. What if these cases were connected? What if the city was not facing isolated homicides at all? What if someone was deliberately selecting victims from the same vulnerable community? Questions multiplied faster than evidence. Meanwhile, newspapers carried reports that many residents skimmed over with morning coffee before heading to work. One murder. Then another. Cities become strangely accustomed to tragedy. Until tragedy develops a pattern. Until ordinary citizens begin altering routines. Until whispers replace certainty. Even then, countless people remained unaware that a serial predator might already be walking among them. Because the victims belonged to a community that was still largely invisible to much of America. Their stories often received less attention than they deserved. Their private lives became subjects of speculation instead of compassion. Their humanity was sometimes overshadowed by prejudice. The killer, whether intentionally or instinctively, appeared to exploit exactly that reality. Every unsolved case leaves behind more than evidence. It leaves behind unfinished conversations. Families waiting beside telephones that never ring. Friends wondering whether one different decision might have changed everything. Investigators replaying interviews long after retirement. And somewhere, perhaps, a witness who has spent decades carrying one memory that still refuses to fade. As winter gave way to spring and spring surrendered to summer, San Francisco remained breathtakingly beautiful. The hills were still impossibly steep. The bay still shimmered beneath changing skies. The fog still rolled through the Golden Gate as though it belonged to another century. Beauty and horror have always shared the same geography. Sometimes separated by only a single street. Sometimes by only a single conversation. The city did not yet understand that one of its darkest chapters had only just begun. The first body had been found. The first investigation had begun. But the man with the sketchbook was still out there. Still blending into crowded rooms. Still searching faces. Still waiting for the next conversation to begin. San Francisco has always been a city of contradictions. It is a place where Victorian homes cling to impossibly steep hills, while modern skyscrapers cast long shadows across neighborhoods that have existed for more than a century. It is a city where the Pacific Ocean breathes against rocky shores with ancient patience, while only a few miles away, thousands of people hurry through crowded streets, chasing the future. Beauty and hardship have always lived side by side here, separated not by distance, but by perspective. In the early 1970s, that contrast felt sharper than ever. The America outside San Francisco was changing, but slowly. The civil rights movement had reshaped conversations about equality. Anti-war protests had challenged political authority. Young people questioned traditions that their parents had accepted without hesitation. Yet for many gay Americans, genuine freedom remained painfully out of reach. A man could earn a college degree, serve in the military, build a successful career, and still spend every day terrified that one unexpected question might destroy everything. The fear was not imaginary. Employers dismissed workers after discovering their sexuality. Landlords refused to renew leases. Families cut off contact. Churches condemned them. Newspapers occasionally published names after police raids on gay establishments, exposing people who had spent years carefully protecting their private lives. One headline could erase an entire future. That was the America many people were trying to escape. And for them, San Francisco looked almost mythical. It was spoken about in quiet conversations between trusted friends. Stories traveled across state lines about a neighborhood where two men could walk together without immediately looking over their shoulders. About bars where people laughed openly instead of whispering. About bookstores that displayed novels with gay protagonists instead of hiding them behind counters. About communities where nobody demanded explanations. Those stories were not perfect. But they offered hope. Hope has always been powerful enough to make people leave everything behind. Throughout the late 1960s and into the early 1970s, buses, trains, and airplanes carried thousands of people westward. Some arrived with steady jobs already waiting. Others stepped into the city carrying little more than a suitcase, a few dollars, and the determination to finally live honestly. Many never looked back. Among the neighborhoods welcoming these newcomers, none became more symbolic than Castro. Today, the Castro is recognized around the world, but during those years it was still transforming into what history would remember. Small businesses appeared beside modest apartment buildings. Coffee shops buzzed with conversation from morning until late evening. Grocery stores, neighborhood bars, bookstores, record shops, and restaurants formed the heart of a growing community built less upon geography than shared experience. People recognized one another. Not always by name. Sometimes simply by understanding. There was an unspoken relief in being surrounded by strangers who did not require explanations. For the first time in their lives, many men could stop pretending. Or at least pretend a little less. On weekends, sidewalks filled with people who had spent years hiding pieces of themselves. Laughter drifted through open windows. Music spilled from jukeboxes inside neighborhood bars. Couples lingered outside cafes over coffee that had long since grown cold, because conversation mattered more than time. It looked like freedom. And in many ways, it was. But freedom does not erase fear overnight. Even inside San Francisco, countless men remained invisible. Some traveled into the Castro only after dark. Some parked several streets away to avoid being recognized. Others carefully checked every passing face before entering a familiar bar. Not because they expected violence. Because they feared discovery. There were doctors who worried about losing medical licenses. Teachers afraid of angry parents. Military veterans who feared public disgrace. Business executives whose careers depended upon maintaining carefully constructed public images. Some had wives. Some had children. Some genuinely loved their families, while simultaneously carrying a secret they believed could never be spoken aloud. The burden of living two separate lives is difficult to describe. Every conversation becomes an exercise in caution. Every introduction carries calculation. Every friendship requires decisions about how much truth can safely be shared. One careless sentence can undo years of carefully maintained silence. Imagine spending decades editing your own life before speaking. Replacing names with pronouns. Inventing fictional relationships. Laughing at jokes that quietly wound you because objecting would invite questions. Now imagine finally finding one place where those exhausting performances can briefly stop. That was the emotional landscape of San Francisco. It attracted dreamers. It also attracted people carrying loneliness so profound that even ordinary kindness could feel overwhelming. The man who would later become known as the doula appeared to understand exactly that. Whether through instinct, observation, or personal experience, he seemed to recognize that loneliness creates opportunity. He did not need force to approach strangers. He simply needed patience. The bars of San Francisco, in the 1970s, were not merely places to drink. They were social lifelines. Some visitors arrived looking for romance. Others searched for friendship. Many came because it was one of the few places where they could relax without constantly policing every word that left their mouths. Inside, conversations stretched across crowded tables. People exchanged stories about hometowns they never intended to revisit. They spoke about difficult parents, former lovers, new apartments, jobs that demanded silence, dreams they had postponed for years. Outside, the city continued moving without noticing them. Inside, they belonged. It was precisely the kind of environment where strangers naturally met. No dating apps existed. No social media profiles. No digital footprints. Everything began face to face. A smile across the room. An introduction from a mutual acquaintance. Or someone quietly asking whether the empty chair beside you was available. Trust developed differently then. People relied on instinct. Sometimes instinct failed. Investigators would later learn that the unknown killer appeared remarkably comfortable in these environments. He was not described as loud or intimidating. Survivors consistently remembered someone almost unexpectedly ordinary. Young. Soft-spoken. Neatly dressed. Confident without appearing arrogant. He blended into the room instead of dominating it. Nothing about his appearance announced danger. If anything, witnesses later suggested the opposite. He appeared approachable. That detail has haunted investigators for decades. Human beings instinctively search for warning signs. Aggressive behavior. Threatening language. Visible anger. The doula reportedly displayed none of those characteristics during initial encounters. Instead, he offered conversation. Then something even more unusual. He drew people. A pencil and a small sketchbook became extensions of his personality. While others relied upon jokes or compliments, he relied upon observation. He studied faces with quiet concentration. Not in a way that felt uncomfortable. More like an artist fascinated by detail. Within minutes, simple lines began transforming blank paper into recognizable portraits. The sketches were not elaborate masterpieces. They did not need to be. Their value lay elsewhere. Most people are unaccustomed to becoming someone's subject. To watch another person carefully capture your features creates an immediate sense of connection. It suggests attention, patience, interest. For someone who had spent years feeling invisible to much of society, that attention could be unexpectedly powerful. Perhaps the victims smiled when they saw the finished drawing. Perhaps they laughed at how quickly it resembled them. Perhaps they thanked the young artist before folding the sketch into a pocket. Those ordinary moments now exist only as possibilities. The killer never told his story. Most of his victims never had the chance. After the drawing came conversation. After conversation came familiarity. Then came the suggestion. Would you like to get some fresh air? Maybe take a walk. The city was beautiful at night. Ocean Beach was only a short drive away. Golden Gate Park was peaceful after dark. There was no reason to suspect that accepting such an invitation might become the final decision of someone's life. Serial predators often rely upon isolation. Not dramatic kidnappings. Not public confrontations. Simply creating circumstances where witnesses disappear. A quiet beach after sunset. A deserted walking path. A parking area surrounded by darkness. San Francisco offered countless beautiful places where the city seemed to dissolve into silence. Ocean Beach stretched for miles beside the Pacific, where crashing waves erased smaller sounds beneath endless white noise. After sunset, thick coastal fog frequently rolled across the sand, reducing visibility until familiar landmarks faded into ghostly outlines. Couples seeking privacy often walked there. So did solitary dreamers hoping the sound of the ocean might quiet their thoughts. Golden Gate Park offered a different kind of isolation. Its winding paths disappeared beneath towering trees planted generations earlier. During daylight, families gathered near gardens and museums. Children sailed toy boats across quiet ponds. But after midnight, much of the park belonged to darkness. Streetlights illuminated only fragments of the landscape. Beyond their glow, shadows merged together beneath branches that seemed almost endless. It was beautiful. It was peaceful. And under the wrong circumstances, it could become terrifying. No one walking those paths in 1974 could have imagined they were entering one of the most haunting chapters in the city's criminal history. Because evil rarely announces its arrival. Sometimes it enters quietly, carrying nothing more threatening than a pencil, a folded piece of paper, and a smile that appears completely sincere. The city itself seemed almost determined to hide secrets. Every morning, dense gray fog rolled through the Golden Gate, before drifting between the hills like a living thing. It softened sharp edges, muted bright colors, and wrapped entire neighborhoods in a silence that felt strangely intimate. By noon, sunlight often burned through the mist, revealing postcard views that attracted visitors from around the world. Tourists pointed cameras toward cable cars, climbing impossible streets, fishermen cast lines beneath weathered piers, and children laughed as sea lions barked somewhere along the waterfront. To anyone arriving for the first time, San Francisco looked almost enchanted. But every city has another face. When daylight faded, familiar streets changed character. Neon signs flickered awake above taverns and restaurants. The smell of salt water mixed with cigarette smoke drifting from open doorways. Jazz poured out of one club while rock music thundered from another. Taxi headlights reflected across rain-slick pavement, creating rivers of white and amber beneath the evening sky. Night belonged to different people. Some worked until dawn. Some searched for companionship. Some searched for escape. And somewhere among them, one man searched for something else entirely. No one knows where he lived. No one knows what kind of childhood shaped him. Investigators have never confirmed whether he attended college, held a steady job, or returned each night to a family that suspected nothing. His life before and after the murders remains largely invisible. That absence has become one of the defining characteristics of the case. Most notorious serial killers eventually leave behind diaries, interviews, family photographs, employment records, or psychological evaluations. Researchers can trace the evolution of their personalities from troubled childhoods into violent adulthood. The Doodler offers almost none of that. He exists in history, almost entirely through the memories of other people. A face remembered by survivors. A voice described in police interviews. A sketchbook. A knife. And a trail of lives that ended far too soon. For detectives, this presented an extraordinary challenge. Without a known identity, every attempt to understand motive became speculative. Did he hate his victims? Did he envy them? Did he see himself reflected in them? Or was violence itself the destination, with every conversation serving only as a path toward it? Each theory carried pieces of truth. None could be proven. Psychologists who later reviewed the known evidence often pointed to the remarkable contrast between his apparent social ease and the brutality of the attacks. Predatory offenders frequently rely on manipulation before they rely on force. Violence is expensive. Manipulation is efficient. If someone willingly walks beside you into isolation, there is no need to attract attention. No struggle inside a crowded bar. No witnesses calling police. Only two people disappearing into the night together, looking no different from countless others enjoying an evening walk. It is a method built not upon physical strength alone, but upon emotional intelligence. He appeared capable of reading people. Recognizing loneliness. Recognizing hesitation. Recognizing the subtle relief that crossed someone's face when they believed they had met another kind stranger. That may have been his greatest weapon. Not the knife. Understanding. There is another detail that makes this case particularly haunting. The victims did not fit a single stereotype. They came from different backgrounds. Different ages. Different professions. One was approaching 50. Another was in his 20s. Others were in their early 30s. Their lives followed separate paths before intersecting with the same unknown man. What connected them was not occupation or nationality. It was vulnerability. Each lived within a society that still demanded silence about an essential part of who they were. That silence extended beyond everyday life. It influenced criminal investigations as well. When detectives questioned friends, co-workers, or relatives, many conversations unfolded carefully. Some families knew very little about the private lives of the men they had lost. Some friends worried that speaking honestly would expose people who were still alive. Others feared newspapers would publish names or details capable of destroying reputations. Investigators found themselves working inside a maze constructed long before the murders began. Every unanswered question created another obstacle. Every withheld truth widened the darkness surrounding the case. Looking back decades later, it is tempting to wonder whether modern technology would have changed everything. Cell phones would have recorded movements. Security cameras might have captured faces leaving bars. DNA databases could have linked evidence across multiple crime scenes. Digital messages might have documented final conversations. None of those tools existed. The investigation depended upon memories. Upon interviews. Upon physical evidence that nature itself often erased. Several crime scenes lay outdoors, exposed to coastal moisture, shifting sand, rain, and relentless Pacific winds. Each passing hour quietly removed details investigators desperately needed. Footprints disappeared. Trace evidence scattered. The environment became an unwilling accomplice, preserving beauty while destroying clues. The detectives assigned to these cases understood they were racing against more than a killer. They were racing against time itself. Yet despite those limitations, small similarities continued emerging. Victims had reportedly spent time in areas known within San Francisco's gay community. The attacks demonstrated strikingly similar levels of violence. No significant theft appeared to motivate the crimes. Gradually, individual investigations began converging. Files once stored separately were placed side by side. Photographs were compared. Maps spread across conference tables. Colored pins marked locations stretching from Ocean Beach to Golden Gate Park and beyond. Patterns slowly revealed themselves. The realization did not arrive dramatically. There was no detective slamming a fist onto a desk while declaring the existence of a serial killer. Reality unfolded more quietly. A conversation between investigators. A repeated observation. A growing certainty that coincidence could no longer explain what they were seeing. Somewhere in San Francisco, one offender appeared to be selecting victims from the same community with disturbing consistency. The discovery changed everything. It also raised an unsettling question. If investigators had identified a pattern, had the killer recognized it as well? Serial offenders often evolve. They learn from each encounter. They refine routines. They eliminate mistakes. Every successful escape reinforces confidence. If that was happening here, then the city faced someone becoming increasingly experienced with every passing month. Meanwhile, ordinary life continued uninterrupted for most residents. Morning newspapers carried headlines competing with political scandals, economic concerns, and international events. Cable cars remained crowded. Restaurants remained full. The Pacific continued sending waves crashing against black coastal rocks exactly as it had for centuries. The city breathed normally. Only a small circle of detectives fully understood that something profoundly abnormal was unfolding beneath its surface. They could not yet predict how many victims there would be. They could not identify the next target. They could not even place a name beside the man responsible. They had only fragments. A description. A pattern. A growing sense of urgency. And somewhere beyond the reach of every investigation, the young man with the sketchbook continued moving through San Francisco's nightlife, carrying himself with the same quiet confidence that had already convinced strangers to trust him. The stage had been set long before anyone realized a serial predator was at work. The city offered hope to thousands seeking acceptance. The killer transformed that hope into opportunity. Before detectives would begin chasing him across witness statements and crime scene reports, before newspapers would give him the name history still remembers, another story had to be told. It was not the story of the murderer. It was the story of the men whose lives had brought them to San Francisco searching for freedom, never imagining that the city promising them sanctuary would also become the place where some of them would meet their final night. Every murder begins long before a life is taken. It begins with birthdays that are celebrated, childhood photographs tucked into family albums, first jobs, awkward teenage dreams, letters from distant relatives, and ordinary mornings that seem too insignificant to remember until they become all that remains. When history speaks about serial killers, the victims are often reduced to numbers. Victim 1. Victim 2. Victim 3. A timeline. A crime scene. A cause of death. Their lives shrink into evidence folders while the person who destroyed them becomes the center of every documentary, every newspaper headline, every late-night conversation. The Doodler case deserves a different approach. Because before these men became names inside police reports, they were sons, friends, co-workers, neighbors, and dreamers. They laughed at private jokes. They planned vacations. They worried about paying rent. They celebrated birthdays. They wondered whether happiness was finally within reach. Their stories did not begin on the nights they died. They began decades earlier. The first confirmed victim was Gerald Kavanagh. He was 49 years old when his life ended on a cold January night in 1974. Compared to some of the younger victims who would follow, Gerald belonged to a different generation entirely. He had been born into a world where being openly gay was almost unimaginable. Throughout much of his youth, homosexuality was spoken about in whispers, condemned by churches, criminalized by law in many places, and classified by much of society as something shameful or dangerous. People learned to survive by disappearing into ordinary lives. Some never married because they feared the lie would become unbearable. Others did marry, convincing themselves that love could somehow be forced into existence through determination alone. Many simply remained alone. Gerald had immigrated from Canada, hoping, like so many others, to build a better future in the United States. Immigration itself is an act of optimism. No one leaves familiar streets, lifelong friends, and family traditions without believing something better waits beyond the horizon. San Francisco, with its growing reputation for openness, must have seemed full of possibility. No historical record can fully reconstruct Gerald's private thoughts during those years. We do not know exactly what dreams he carried across the border. We do not know what disappointments shaped him before arriving in California. We cannot honestly claim to know whom he loved, or what memories brought him comfort during quiet evenings. What we do know is enough. He was a real man. He mattered to people. And someone chose to end his life with extraordinary violence. That truth alone deserves remembrance. Imagine Gerald walking through San Francisco during those first weeks of 1974. Winter along the Pacific coast carries a unique atmosphere. The air feels damp rather than bitterly cold. Fog settles low over the ocean before drifting inland, blurring familiar landmarks into pale silhouettes. Storefront windows glow warmly against gray afternoons. Coffee shops fill with people escaping the chill outside. Perhaps Gerald had favorite streets. Perhaps he recognized bartenders by name. Perhaps there were places where someone greeted him with a smile before he even reached the counter. Every city slowly becomes personal. Certain corners hold memories. Certain restaurants become traditions. Certain beaches offer quiet moments when life feels less complicated. That humanity often disappears inside criminal investigations. Detectives naturally focus on final hours. Families remember entire lifetimes. When Gerald's body was discovered near Ocean Beach on January 24, investigators immediately confronted the brutal reality of his final moments. The injuries indicated repeated stab wounds. There was no evidence suggesting a random accident. No indication that nature had somehow caused what lay before them. Another human being had stood close enough to attack again and again. Every homicide scene tells two stories. One belongs to the victim. The other belongs to the offender. In the earliest hours of the investigation, detectives knew almost nothing about either. Gerald's death initially appeared isolated. Tragic. Violent. But isolated. There was no reason yet to suspect that other men would soon share similar fates. As investigators interviewed people who knew Gerald, they attempted to reconstruct ordinary details. Where had he gone recently? Who had seen him last? Had he mentioned meeting anyone? Did he have enemies? Every answer generated more questions. Sometimes the smallest recollection, a passing conversation, an unfamiliar face, an unexpected phone call, can redirect an entire investigation. Sometimes nothing meaningful emerges at all. The silence surrounding Gerald's final hours proved frustrating. It also foreshadowed the difficulties that would define the entire case. Many interactions within San Francisco's gay community during the early 1970s occurred privately. Not because secrecy was exciting. Because secrecy often felt necessary. Someone might introduce a new acquaintance using only a first name. Phone numbers were memoized rather than written down. Addresses were shared carefully. Entire relationships existed beyond the awareness of co-workers or relatives. To modern investigators accustomed to digital records, surveillance cameras, and mobile phone data, that world seems almost impossible to reconstruct. Back then, people simply disappeared into the night. If they failed to return, detectives were left chasing memories. The murderer appeared to understand exactly how fragile those memories could become. Gerald would not remain the only victim. Months later, another life would be violently interrupted. Joseph Stevens was only 27 years old. The age difference between Joseph and Gerald immediately challenged assumptions that investigators often make about serial offenders. This was not someone targeting a narrowly defined demographic based solely on age. Instead, something else connected the victims. Joseph belonged to a younger generation than Gerald. He had grown up during years when cultural attitudes had begun shifting, however slowly. Across America, social movements questioned long-established prejudices. Young people challenged traditions their parents had rarely dared to confront. Yet those changes were uneven. Progress in one city often meant little elsewhere. For countless gay men, moving to San Francisco represented not merely relocation, but reinvention. A chance to write a new chapter, before the previous one consumed them forever. Joseph's future should have stretched across decades. Instead, it ended before his 30th birthday. Again, history preserves only fragments. The surviving records reveal little about his private ambitions or daily routines. That absence should not tempt us into filling the gaps with fiction. The truth is compelling enough. He lived. He hoped. He trusted someone. And he never came home. By the time Joseph's death entered police files, investigators could no longer ignore similarities that had begun quietly emerging. The violence felt familiar. The victim profile echoed earlier concerns. Questions once dismissed as coincidence returned with greater urgency. Was someone deliberately hunting gay men? Or were investigators seeing patterns that did not truly exist? No experienced detective welcomes the possibility of a serial killer. Serial murder means every unsolved day carries the risk of another family receiving devastating news. Meanwhile, life continued throughout San Francisco with remarkable indifference. People hurried to work. Neighbors argued over parking spaces. Musicians performed in crowded clubs. Couples celebrated anniversaries. Children played in public parks, where investigators would later search for evidence. Cities possess an extraordinary ability to function normally while unimaginable tragedy unfolds only blocks away. That contrast can feel almost unbearable. Somewhere, someone mourns. Elsewhere, strangers celebrate birthdays. Neither knows the other exists. For the families of Gerald and Joseph, the world had already changed forever. For everyone else, the darkest chapter of the Doodler investigation was only beginning. Michael Whelan was 32 years old. By every ordinary measure, he should have had decades of life still waiting for him. 32 is an age when many people begin believing they finally understand who they are. The uncertainty of youth slowly gives way to confidence. Careers become more stable. Friendships deepen. The future begins to feel less like a dream and more like a road that can actually be planned. For many gay men living in San Francisco, during the mid-1970s, reaching that point had required extraordinary courage. It meant surviving years of rejection. Years of silence. Years spent pretending to be someone else simply to avoid becoming a target. By the time someone finally arrived in San Francisco, they were often exhausted. Not physically. Emotionally. Imagine spending your entire adult life carefully measuring every sentence before speaking. Imagine instinctively changing the subject whenever co-workers ask whether you're dating anyone. Imagine attending family holidays, where every conversation reminds you that the version of yourself sitting at the dinner table is only half real. That kind of loneliness cannot easily be explained. It accumulates quietly. 1 year becomes 5. 5 become 10. Eventually, even ordinary kindness begins to feel extraordinary. Perhaps that is why San Francisco mattered so deeply. It was never perfect. Crime existed. Discrimination still existed. Violence certainly existed. But for thousands of people, it was the first place where they believed they could finally breathe. Michael was one of the men trying to build a life within that fragile sense of freedom. Like the other victims, history records only fragments of his personal story. There are no lengthy interviews in which he describes his dreams. No memoirs. No chance to hear him explain what drew him to the city, or what he imagined his future would become. The silence surrounding these victims is one of the greatest tragedies of the case. The killer left investigators with crime scenes. Time left the victims with very few opportunities to tell their own stories. What remains are traces. A name. An age. The memory of people who knew them. And the certainty that someone who mattered simply vanished from the lives of everyone who loved him. As detectives examined Michael's case, similarities with the earlier murders became increasingly difficult to dismiss. The attacks demonstrated the same shocking intimacy. There were no reports suggesting prolonged negotiations, financial motives, or random street violence. The offender appeared to approach victims personally, gain their confidence, then strike with overwhelming force once isolation had been achieved. Each new file deepened an uncomfortable realization. This offender did not appear impulsive. He appeared organized. He selected locations where interruption was unlikely. He chose methods that required complete control over another human being. Most importantly, he disappeared afterward without leaving investigators anything substantial to follow. That combination frightened experienced detectives. Not because they believed the killer possessed supernatural abilities. Because disciplined offenders are often the most difficult to identify. Chaos leaves evidence. Preparation removes it. The next confirmed victim was Klaus Christmann. He was 31 years old. Originally from Germany, Klaus had built a life far from his birthplace. Like countless immigrants before him, he carried with him not only a different language and culture, but also the hope that distance could create opportunity. Moving across an ocean demands faith. Faith that tomorrow will be kinder than yesterday. Faith that unfamiliar streets may eventually feel like home. Faith that somewhere, acceptance is possible. For many immigrants, San Francisco represented exactly that possibility. Its diversity made difference feel ordinary. Accents blended together. Cultures overlapped. People arrived from every corner of the world searching for reinvention. Klaus became part of that living mosaic. Then, like the others before him, his life ended in extraordinary violence. The growing list of victims forced investigators to confront another painful reality. These were not anonymous statistics. They were members of an entire community, beginning to recognize that someone might be hunting men exactly like them. Fear spread quietly. Not through official warnings. Through conversations. Friends telling friends to be careful. Bartenders mentioning another murder. Whispers exchanged across crowded rooms. People began watching unfamiliar faces more carefully. Some stopped leaving bars with strangers altogether. Others insisted on walking in groups whenever possible. Still, caution has limits. Loneliness does not disappear because danger exists. Human beings continue searching for connection even when fear tells them to stay home. Predators understand this. They rely upon hope overcoming caution. Another victim soon joined the growing investigation. Frederick Kappin was 32 years old. His death reinforced the pattern detectives had been slowly assembling piece by piece. Again, the violence. Again, the apparent absence of robbery. Again, another man connected to the same social environment. By this stage, investigators increasingly believed they were searching for one offender rather than several unrelated killers. Yet believing and proving are entirely different things. The physical evidence remained frustratingly limited. Crime scenes located outdoors offered little protection from weather. Rain diluted traces. Wind scattered debris. Footprints disappeared beneath shifting sand or damp soil. Each passing day erased opportunities. Modern forensic science had not yet arrived. There was no national DNA database waiting to connect invisible biological evidence. No smartphones documenting last known movements. No surveillance cameras quietly recording every street corner. Investigators relied on witness interviews, physical observations, and instinct sharpened through years of homicide work. Sometimes those tools were enough. Sometimes they were not. This case would test every limitation of that era. Then came Harold Goldberg. At 66 years old, he was significantly older than most of the other confirmed victims. His inclusion further complicated attempts to define the killer's preferred target. Age clearly mattered less than circumstance. Whatever drew the offender toward his victims extended beyond simple demographics. Harold had lived long enough to witness enormous historical change. He had experienced decades, during which society slowly evolved, while still refusing full acceptance to people like him. To survive into his 60s as a gay man, during that period required resilience few people today can truly appreciate. He had lived through years when secrecy was not simply advisable but essential. Perhaps San Francisco had offered him a measure of peace during the later years of his life. Perhaps he finally believed he could exist without constantly looking over his shoulder. Instead, his name became another entry in an expanding homicide investigation. 6 confirmed victims. 6 interrupted lives. 6 families left searching for explanations that never fully came. Yet investigators believed the true number might be considerably higher. Some estimates suggested the same offender could have been responsible for as many as 14, or even 16 murders. Those additional cases have never been conclusively linked, but similarities in victimology and method kept them under continuing review. If those suspicions are correct, the visible portion of the tragedy represents only part of the story. There may be other men whose names never became permanently associated with the doodler because the evidence was simply too incomplete to satisfy investigators. That uncertainty weighs heavily over every discussion of the case. It reminds us how easily history can lose people. Not because they were unimportant. Because proof sometimes disappears before truth can be established. The greatest injustice committed by serial killers is not only taking lives. It is reducing unique human beings to recurring patterns. The police saw similarities, because similarities helped identify an offender. Families saw birthdays, laughter, holiday dinners, favorite songs, familiar voices, and empty chairs that would never again be filled. Both perspectives are true. One seeks justice. The other grieves love. As the list of victims continued growing, detectives understood something deeply troubling. Somewhere in San Francisco, another man was almost certainly living an ordinary life between murders. He may have passed investigators on crowded sidewalks, without either side recognizing the other. He may have smiled politely at neighbors each morning. He may even have returned to the same bars where friends gathered to mourn the latest victim. That possibility transformed every public place into a question. Who was he? How many times had witnesses unknowingly looked directly at him? How many sketches had he drawn that ended with nothing more sinister than a handshake? And how many ended with someone silently disappearing into the darkness? Those questions would soon become even more urgent. Because despite the growing number of victims, the investigation was about to reveal something unexpected. The killer had made a mistake. Not at a crime scene. Not in the evidence he left behind. He had allowed someone to survive. The first time someone accepts an invitation from a stranger, nothing about the moment feels historic. It feels ordinary. A conversation has gone well. The laughter has come easily. Two people who had never met only an hour earlier now find themselves finishing each other's stories, sharing another drink, or lingering after the music has faded. One of them glances toward the door and suggests getting some fresh air before the night ends. It is a scene that has played out millions of times in cities around the world. Most of those nights become memories. Some become relationships. A few become tragedies. For the men who crossed paths with the individual later known as the Doodler, that seemingly harmless decision often became the final chapter of their lives. The pattern, reconstructed years later through police investigations and surviving witness accounts, was chilling in its simplicity. He did not stalk victims through deserted streets. He did not force strangers into waiting vehicles. He did not rely on brute strength at the beginning. Instead, he relied on something infinitely more effective. Consent. Not consent to violence. Consent to companionship. He created an atmosphere in which leaving together felt completely natural. A drink became a conversation. A conversation became familiarity. Familiarity became trust. Trust opened the door to isolation. That progression was so subtle that, even decades later, investigators struggled to determine exactly where the ordinary evening ended and the nightmare began. Picture one of those nights. The Castro district is alive with energy. Music spills from crowded bars onto the sidewalks. Taxicabs move slowly through narrow streets, their headlights reflecting off damp pavement left behind by the evening fog. Couples laugh as they weave through groups of friends. The air carries the scent of cigarette smoke, coffee, and the Pacific Ocean only a few miles away. Inside one neighborhood bar, conversations overlap until individual voices become impossible to separate. Someone celebrates a birthday. Someone else orders another round. Near the back of the room, a young man quietly sketches on a small pad of paper. He is not trying to attract attention. Attention comes to him naturally. Sooner or later, someone notices the drawing. Did you make that? A smile. A nod. Perhaps he offers to draw another. Within minutes, two strangers are talking as though they have known each other far longer than a single evening. No one watching from across the room would see anything unusual. In fact, it might even seem charming. There is something disarming about watching an artist work. People instinctively associate creativity with sensitivity, patience, gentleness. Very few people look at someone holding a pencil and imagine that the same hands may later grip a knife. That contradiction remains one of the most disturbing aspects of the Doodler investigation. He reportedly presented himself as thoughtful rather than threatening. Observers remembered intelligence, politeness, calmness. Nothing about his behavior suggested uncontrolled rage. Yet the crime scenes told an entirely different story. Somewhere after those conversations ended, something changed. Investigators have never established exactly how the transition occurred. Did they drive together? Did they walk? Did they stop to continue talking before the attack began? Those moments disappeared with the victims. All that remained was the destination. Ocean Beach, after midnight, is unlike almost any other place in San Francisco. During the day, families scatter blankets across the sand while children chase waves that always seem to move just beyond reach. Surfers wait patiently beyond the breakers, rising and falling with the rhythm of the sea. Joggers pass dog walkers. Tourists pause to photograph the endless horizon. At night, that same beach belongs to the wind. The ocean becomes louder. Darkness erases distance. Fog rolls across the shoreline, so heavily that familiar landmarks vanish within minutes. Standing alone there after midnight can create the strange sensation that the rest of the world has disappeared. Only the waves remain. Only the sound of water striking sand over and over again with relentless patience. It is beautiful. It is peaceful. It is also terrifyingly isolated. If two figures walk along the shoreline, they quickly become silhouettes swallowed by mist. Voices disappear beneath the crashing surf. A struggle lasting only seconds could easily go unnoticed. Golden Gate Park offered another kind of isolation. Unlike the open coastline, the park enclosed people within towering trees and winding pathways. Streetlights illuminated only small circles of ground before surrendering everything else to darkness. Branches shifted overhead whenever the wind strengthened, casting moving shadows that seemed almost alive. During daylight, children sailed toy boats across ponds while families visited museums and gardens. After dark, entire sections of the park became nearly deserted. The city still surrounded it. Yet it felt impossibly far away. These were the environments where investigators believe several victims spent their final moments. Not abandoned warehouses. Not hidden basements. Public places transformed into private killing grounds simply because few people remained awake to witness what happened there. The attacks themselves were astonishingly violent. The murderer carried no firearm. Instead, he chose a knife. Criminologists have long noted that knife attacks differ psychologically from shootings. A firearm creates distance. A knife destroys it. The attacker must stand within arm's reach of another human being. He hears breathing, feels movement, sees fear. Every strike demands another conscious decision. To continue. To stop. To continue again. Medical examinations revealed repeated stab wounds to the victims' upper bodies. The injuries suggested extraordinary force and determination. These were not quick assaults intended merely to incapacitate. The violence continued well beyond what would have been necessary to overcome resistance. That level of overkill often raises difficult questions for investigators. Was the offender expressing hatred, fear, internal conflict, or simply ensuring that no victim would survive to identify him? Without a confession, motive remains speculation. The wounds, however, speak with undeniable clarity. Whoever committed these murders was willing to remain frighteningly close to his victims until the very end. There is another detail that has continued to haunt detectives. Little evidence suggested robbery. Wallets were often still present. Personal belongings were not systematically removed. Money did not appear to be the objective. If financial gain had motivated the attacks, investigators would have expected entirely different crime scenes. Instead, the victims themselves appeared to be the focus. That realization changed the direction of the investigation. A killer seeking money can stop at any time. A killer seeking people rarely does. By the summer of 1974, detectives began recognizing the terrifying possibility that every unsolved day represented another opportunity for the offender to strike again. Yet they still lacked the most essential element of any homicide investigation. They had no face to place beside the violence. Only descriptions, too vague to identify a stranger in a city of hundreds of thousands. Only fragments. A polite young man. Soft-spoken. Well-dressed. An artist with a sketchbook. Somewhere inside those fragments existed the truth. But truth, like the fog drifting across San Francisco each evening, remained frustratingly beyond reach. And while investigators searched for a ghost, the killer continued moving through the city's nightlife with the confidence of someone who had discovered an unsettling fact. No one suspected him. Not yet. Confidence is a dangerous thing in the mind of a serial offender. The first murder is often accompanied by uncertainty. There is fear of being caught, fear of making mistakes, fear that every passing police car somehow knows the truth. Every unexpected knock at the door sends the heart racing. Every newspaper headline feels personal. If the killer escapes, that fear begins to change. Days pass. Then weeks. Eventually months. Life returns to what appears to be normal. The realization settles in slowly. No one is coming. No one knows. For some offenders, that realization becomes intoxicating. Investigators studying serial predators have often observed that success breeds confidence, and confidence breeds repetition. The more often an offender avoids detection, the more comfortable his routines become. Small precautions are refined. Weaknesses are corrected. The crimes begin to follow familiar rhythms. Although the identity of the doodler has never been confirmed publicly, the sequence of attacks suggests someone who grew increasingly comfortable operating within San Francisco's nightlife. He understood where people gathered. He understood when they were most likely to leave alone. Most importantly, he appeared to understand that many of the men he approached carried private lives they were desperate to protect. That knowledge created an invisible shield. Imagine being a man in 1974 who had spent years hiding his sexuality from family, employers, and neighbors. Now imagine surviving a violent attack. Reporting the crime might save future lives. It might also expose every secret you had spent decades protecting. That impossible choice became one of the cruelest aspects of this investigation. The killer may never have consciously planned to exploit social prejudice. But whether by design or instinct, he operated within a world where silence had already become a survival skill. That silence benefited him. As detectives pieced together witness statements, they noticed another unsettling pattern. The victims were not reckless people. Popular imagination often assumes that victims somehow ignored obvious warning signs. Real life is rarely that simple. Most violent offenders do not appear violent when first encountered. If they did, very few people would willingly accompany them anywhere. The doodler reportedly appeared composed. He spoke calmly. He maintained eye contact without appearing intimidating. His conversations flowed naturally. He did not overwhelm people with charm in the theatrical way portrayed in films. Instead, he seemed ordinary. Perhaps that was his greatest disguise. Ordinary people are trusted every day. The man standing beside you in line at a cafe. The stranger offering directions. The passenger reading a newspaper on the bus. Danger rarely introduces itself dramatically. It often wears the face of normality. That reality became painfully evident as investigators reconstructed the final hours of several victims. Many had likely believed they were simply extending an enjoyable evening. A walk. Fresh air. More conversation. Nothing about those decisions would have seemed extraordinary at the time. Only afterward did those ordinary moments become unbearably tragic. Somewhere between the lights of the city and the darkness of the shoreline, conversation gave way to violence. No witness has ever described exactly what happened during those transitions. Did an argument erupt? Did the attacker suddenly reveal the knife without warning? Did the victims attempt to flee? Those answers disappeared into the night, with the only person who truly knows the sequence of events. Crime scene evidence can explain injuries. It cannot explain final conversations. Perhaps there was confusion. Perhaps disbelief. Many victims of sudden interpersonal violence initially struggle to comprehend what is happening. The human mind instinctively searches for explanations that make sense. This must be a misunderstanding. Surely this will stop. Surely the person standing in front of me cannot actually intend to kill me. Those precious seconds of hesitation can determine everything. The attacks themselves were swift, but extraordinarily brutal. Repeated stab wounds indicate determination. Investigators understood immediately that they were dealing with someone willing to continue long after resistance had diminished. Such violence leaves lasting impressions not only on families, but also on the detectives, crime scene technicians, medical examiners, and patrol officers who encounter its aftermath. Every homicide investigator carries certain scenes for the rest of their life. They rarely speak about them publicly. Yet decades later, they can still remember the weather. The smell of damp earth. The sound of distant traffic. The exact position of a victim's hand. The Doodler investigation would leave many such memories behind. Each new homicide deepened a growing frustration inside the San Francisco Police Department. The similarities between the cases became increasingly persuasive. Outdoor locations. Male victims connected to the city's gay community. Repeated knife wounds. Little indication of robbery. Still, recognizing a pattern is only the beginning of an investigation. Patterns do not hand detectives a name. The city itself complicated every effort to identify the offender. San Francisco, in the mid-1970s, welcomed newcomers almost every day. Artists, students, immigrants, runaways, professionals seeking fresh opportunities. Thousands of unfamiliar faces moved through neighborhoods every month. A polite young man carrying a sketchbook would hardly stand out. If anything, he blended naturally into the city's creative atmosphere. Artists could be found in cafes, parks, galleries, and sidewalks throughout San Francisco. Sketching strangers was not considered suspicious. It was part of the city's cultural identity. One of the most chilling ironies of this case is that the very object making the killer memorable also helped conceal him. A sketchbook suggested creativity, curiosity, sensitivity, not violence. By the end of 1974, whispers had begun circulating more frequently within parts of the local gay community. People warned one another to be cautious. Do not leave alone with someone you just met. Tell a friend where you are going. Be careful around isolated areas after dark. These warnings spread informally. Across bar counters. During private conversations. between close friends. Official public awareness remained limited compared with modern standards. Today, news travels instantly through social media, emergency alerts, and online forums. Back then, information moved person to person. Some heard the warnings. Others never did. Meanwhile, the killer remained free. Whether he followed newspaper coverage is unknown. Whether he recognized that detectives were beginning to connect the murders remains uncertain. But if he did, there is little evidence that it frightened him into stopping. Instead, the attacks continued. Each successful escape widened the gap between investigators and their suspect. Yet hidden within this growing darkness was the first sign that the murderer was not invincible. He had carefully selected isolated locations. He had minimized physical evidence. He had disappeared after each attack. But perfection is almost impossible to maintain forever. Sooner or later, nearly every serial offender makes a mistake. Sometimes they leave behind DNA. Sometimes fingerprints. Sometimes a forgotten possession. The Doodler's mistake was different. He left behind living witnesses. Not one. Several. Men who had looked directly into his face. Men who had spoken with him. Men who had watched his pencil move across paper. Men who, against overwhelming odds, survived. Those survivors would become the closest investigators ever came to looking directly into the eyes of the man who had terrorized San Francisco. Their memories would shape the most significant breakthrough in the entire investigation. They would also reveal one heartbreaking truth. Finding the killer would prove far easier than convincing the world to bring him to justice. Dawn arrives quietly along the western edge of San Francisco. Before the streets fill with commuters and before the cafes unlock their doors, the Pacific Ocean has already been awake for hours. Waves rise out of the darkness with relentless rhythm, crashing against the shoreline, before retreating into the gray horizon. The wind carries the sharp scent of salt and seaweed, while low clouds drift inland, wrapping Ocean Beach in a blanket of mist that softens every outline. It is a landscape capable of breathtaking beauty. It is also a place where silence can conceal terrible things. For the men and women whose jobs required them to respond to unexplained deaths, mornings like these often began with a single telephone call. A body had been found. The words themselves were simple. The reality never was. Long before investigators arrived, ordinary people were often the first witnesses to tragedy. A person walking a dog. A jogger taking advantage of the cool morning air. A maintenance worker beginning another routine shift. Someone expecting nothing more dramatic than another ordinary day. Then, from the corner of an eye, something unusual appeared where it did not belong. A figure lying unnaturally still. Clothing disturbed by the wind. A hand partially buried beneath damp sand. At first, the mind resisted the obvious conclusion. Maybe someone had fallen asleep. Maybe they were intoxicated. Maybe they needed medical assistance. Hope always arrives before certainty. Only after stepping closer did reality begin revealing itself. Human beings possess an instinctive ability to recognize death even before they consciously admit it. The stillness is different. Too complete. Too final. Panic replaces curiosity. Someone runs for help. Someone searches for the nearest telephone. Within minutes, the quiet isolation of the beach begins filling with flashing emergency lights, cutting through the morning fog. Police officers arrive first. They establish a perimeter using little more than rope, wooden stakes, or whatever temporary barriers are available. Curious onlookers gather at a respectful distance, whispering to one another while trying unsuccessfully to understand what has happened. Then come the detectives. Experienced homicide investigators learn to slow themselves before entering every crime scene. Rushing creates mistakes. Mistakes destroy evidence. Every footprint matters. Every discarded object deserves attention. Every inch of ground may hold answers that exist nowhere else. They move carefully, scanning the landscape before approaching the victim. The ocean continues its endless conversation, only yards away. Seagulls circle overhead, oblivious to human grief. Nature never pauses for tragedy. The detectives kneel. They begin observing rather than concluding. The victim's position. Visible injuries. The surrounding terrain. Signs of struggle. Anything that appears out of place. Each observation is recorded before assumptions are allowed to form. In the earliest moments of any homicide investigation, certainty is dangerous. Questions are far more valuable. Who was this man? How long had he been here? Was he killed where he was found? Or had his body been moved? Every answer depended upon evidence that was already beginning to disappear. Outdoor crime scenes are among the most frustrating environments investigators can face. Unlike a locked apartment or an enclosed office, nature refuses to preserve anything. Wind shifts loose debris. Moisture washes away biological traces. Rain alters footprints. Ocean tides reshape the shoreline hour by hour. Evidence does not simply wait to be discovered. It actively vanishes. The detectives working these murders understood they were competing against the elements from the very first minute. Every delay reduced their chances. Photographers documented every angle before anything was touched. Close-up images captured injuries. Wider photographs preserved the relationship between the victim and the surrounding environment. Measurements followed. Distances were carefully noted. Where exactly had the body been found? How far from nearby roads? How close to walking paths? Could passing motorists have seen anything during the previous night? These details might appear insignificant individually. Together, they begin telling a story. Medical examiners arrived soon afterward, bringing with them another perspective. Where detectives asked who and why, forensic specialists focused on how. The wounds themselves became a form of silent testimony. Repeated stab injuries. Concentrated violence. No obvious indication that death had resulted from accident or spontaneous confrontation. This had been intentional. Deliberate. Personal. Knife wounds reveal uncomfortable truths. Each one represents a separate movement. A separate decision. The attacker had remained close enough to feel resistance. Close enough to hear breathing. Close enough to stop at any moment. Yet he continued. That level of violence immediately suggested an offender whose emotional state extended beyond panic or self-defense. Whether driven by rage, obsession, hatred, or another motive entirely, the attack reflected extraordinary commitment. The body was respectfully transported to the medical examiner's office. The scene itself, however, continued speaking. Detectives widened their search. They looked for discarded cigarette butts. Footwear impressions. Bloodstains extending beyond the immediate area. Broken branches. Anything suggesting the sequence of events before death. Sometimes homicide investigations hinge upon remarkably small discoveries. A single button. A fragment of fabric. A forgotten receipt. Sometimes nothing meaningful appears despite hours of meticulous searching. The Doodler crime scenes often belonged to the second category. Nature proved to be an efficient accomplice. Ocean winds scattered lightweight evidence. Fog introduced moisture that complicated forensic recovery. Sand shifted beneath every gust. Investigators frequently found themselves staring across enormous stretches of beach wondering what had already disappeared before they ever arrived. Back at police headquarters, another process quietly unfolded. Detectives gathered around conference tables covered with reports, photographs, and city maps. Each murder began as an individual investigation. Each possessed its own case number, its own witness interviews, its own evidence log. Initially, there was little reason to assume these files belonged together. Cities unfortunately experience homicides with disturbing regularity. Most remain isolated events. But experienced investigators gradually develop instincts for repetition. Certain details refuse to remain coincidences. As additional victims appeared over the following months, those similarities became increasingly difficult to ignore. Male victims. Connections to San Francisco's gay community. Outdoor locations. Repeated knife wounds. Little evidence of robbery. The discussions inside the homicide division slowly changed. Detectives, who had once worked separate investigations, now found themselves comparing notes. One photograph resembled another. One autopsy echoed the previous report. One location shared characteristics with another several miles away. Individually, the details seemed inconclusive. Collectively, they painted a deeply troubling picture. Someone appeared to be hunting. Yet there remained a problem, almost impossible to solve. The killer had left behind remarkably little evidence pointing toward his identity. No wallet. No driver's license. No obvious personal belongings abandoned at the scenes. No witness standing nearby ready to describe exactly what had happened. It was as though the murderer had stepped out of the darkness, committed extraordinary violence, and then dissolved back into the city before anyone realized a crime had occurred. That impression frustrated even veteran investigators. They knew the offender was human. Human beings make mistakes. They overlook details. They panic. They become careless. The challenge lay in discovering which mistake he had made before another victim paid the price. As case files continued accumulating, the atmosphere inside the Homicide Bureau grew noticeably heavier. Every detective understood what the growing pattern implied. If these murders truly shared one offender, then failure to identify him quickly almost guaranteed additional deaths. The investigation had quietly entered a race against time. Unfortunately, time was the one advantage the killer seemed to possess. By the end of 1974, the homicide files no longer fit neatly inside a single detective's workspace. Photographs, handwritten interview notes, forensic reports, neighborhood maps, and evidence logs began accumulating into stacks that seemed to grow heavier with every passing month. Each new victim added another layer to a mystery that refused to reveal its center. Inside police headquarters, the atmosphere had changed. What had once been treated as separate investigations was now becoming something far more alarming. Experienced detectives have a habit of pinning maps to walls. They mark locations, dates, times, known movements, witness sightings. From a distance, the colored pins appear random. Step closer, and patterns begin emerging. Ocean Beach, Golden Gate Park, Lincoln Park. Quiet roads where traffic disappeared after midnight. The locations shared one characteristic above all others. Isolation. Not complete wilderness. Not abandoned buildings. Places that were still public, but became strangely empty once darkness settled over the city. That realization told investigators something important about the offender. He appeared comfortable navigating San Francisco at night. He understood where privacy could be found without attracting suspicion. He was selecting environments that naturally destroyed evidence while dramatically reducing the chance of interruption. That was not luck. It suggested planning. The medical findings reinforced that impression. Autopsy reports repeatedly described similar patterns of injury. The victims had suffered multiple stab wounds, often concentrated around the upper body. The violence was personal and direct. It required physical proximity and sustained effort. Detectives compared photographs taken weeks and months apart. The similarities became impossible to dismiss. This was no longer a collection of unrelated homicides. Somewhere in the city, one offender appeared to be repeating the same horrifying ritual. The challenge now shifted from recognizing the pattern to identifying the person behind it. Investigators returned to the victims' final known movements. Where had they spent the evening? Who had spoken with them? Did anyone remember seeing unfamiliar faces nearby? Every bartender became a potential witness. Every waiter. Every taxi driver. Every patron who happened to remember an unusual conversation. Hundreds of interviews followed. Some witnesses remembered almost nothing. Others confidently described details that later proved inaccurate. Memory is an imperfect instrument, especially when asked to reconstruct an ordinary evening weeks after it occurred. People rarely memorize strangers. Most conversations disappear by the following morning. Only tragedy gives them significance. As detectives worked their way through interviews, another obstacle repeatedly emerged. Many potential witnesses hesitated. Not because they wanted to protect a killer. Because they wanted to protect themselves. To fully explain where they had been, whom they had met, or why they had visited certain establishments often meant revealing deeply personal aspects of their private lives. For many gay men in the mid-1970s, that was an unbearable risk. Coming forward could expose them to employers, families, neighbors, professional organizations. Some feared public humiliation more than police questioning. Others worried that newspapers might eventually publish names connected to the investigation. The detectives found themselves confronting an invisible barrier that had nothing to do with forensic science. It was built from decades of prejudice. Every reluctant interview represented information that might never be fully recovered. Every incomplete statement left another gap inside an already fragile timeline. Some investigators undoubtedly felt frustration. Others recognized the impossible position these witnesses occupied. Cooperating with law enforcement should have been simple. Instead, society had transformed honesty into something dangerous. Meanwhile, newspaper coverage slowly increased. Reports described another victim. Then another. Speculation followed naturally. Was a serial killer operating in San Francisco? Police avoided definitive public statements whenever possible. Announcing the existence of a serial murderer carries enormous consequences. Fear spreads quickly. False reports multiply. Every unsolved assault risks becoming part of the same narrative. Investigators preferred evidence over headlines. Privately, however, the possibility became increasingly difficult to deny. Within the gay community, conversations grew more urgent. Friends urged one another not to leave bars alone. Some agreed to travel in pairs whenever possible. Others exchanged telephone numbers and promised to call after arriving home safely. Bartenders quietly watched unfamiliar faces with greater attention than before. People became more cautious. Yet caution has limits. Human beings cannot live indefinitely in isolation. The desire for companionship does not disappear simply because danger exists. The killer appeared to understand that. He relied upon ordinary human hope. Hope that the stranger smiling across the table might become a friend. Hope that loneliness might finally end. Hope is beautiful. In the wrong hands, it can also become deadly. As detectives revisited every available piece of evidence, they searched desperately for anything the offender might have overlooked. Fingerprints. Hair. Fibers. Anything capable of placing a suspect at multiple crime scenes. The available forensic technology of the era offered only limited assistance. DNA profiling, which would revolutionize criminal investigations years later, did not yet exist. Many trace evidence techniques remained in their infancy. Outdoor environments further complicated every effort. Moisture degraded biological material. Wind scattered microscopic evidence before investigators even arrived. The ocean itself erased countless possibilities with every incoming tide. More than once, detectives must have stood at a crime scene realizing that nature had destroyed answers forever. Those moments are among the most painful in homicide work. Knowing the truth once existed. Knowing it is now gone. Despite those setbacks, investigators refused to abandon the search. They compared witness descriptions repeatedly. Certain characteristics appeared again and again. A young black man. Well-dressed. Soft-spoken. Intelligent. An artist. Someone who carried paper and pencils. At first glance, the description seemed almost frustratingly ordinary. San Francisco was full of artists. Students sketched strangers in cafes. Street performers sold portraits to tourists. Creative young people blended naturally into the city's cultural landscape. Yet the consistency of those descriptions began narrowing the field. Different witnesses, who had never met one another, described remarkably similar encounters. A polite conversation. A quick portrait. An invitation to continue the evening elsewhere. The similarities gave detectives something they had lacked from the beginning. A recognizable behavioral pattern. It was still not enough to identify a suspect. But it was enough to recognize him if the opportunity ever came. The investigation had finally reached a critical point. The victims had spoken through evidence. The crime scenes had revealed patterns. The witnesses had begun describing the same mysterious figure. For the first time since Gerald Kavanaugh's body was discovered months earlier, detectives could almost picture the man they were hunting. Almost. But almost does not solve murder cases. It only sharpens frustration. Unknown to the investigators, however, the breakthrough they desperately needed would not come from fingerprints, blood stains, or abandoned weapons. It would come from the only people who had escaped with their lives. Men who had looked directly into the killer's face. And lived long enough to remember it.